Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the show. Joining us today is James Culver of the CC debate team. On this segment, we'll be talking about Obama's State of the Union speech and the course of American politics in the last month. James, I'd like to start off with the simple question on everyone's minds. Has Obama moved to the right? Has Obama shown greater willingness to reach out to the Republicans in the wake of November's election?
Well, I think that there's a lot of sort of historical analysis given to the Obama presidency that suggests a fairly progressive mindset. You see healthcare expanding the role of the government, or at least the federal government, much more than we've really ever seen in the past, the bailout packages and so forth. But since then, and the culminating sort of thrashing that the Democrats took in the 2010 midterms, we begin to see sort of an alteration that suggests Obama moving more towards the middle, or at least towards some form of compromise. He said that he doesn't want to refight the same battles of the last 2 years, but he is willing to listen to what Republicans have to say about health care. We saw a compromise occur over the tax stimulus, where the Bush tax stimulus gets extended a little bit more. And we also see Obama pushing DADT repeal, or at least that discussion, towards the Congress, as opposed to having it be the federal government making that decision. I think the real issue is less, is Obama moving towards the center, but more, will this sort of strategy of compromise continue? His popularity ratings have been increasing in the lame duck session of Congress, and as he gains popularity again, the question becomes, will he return to sort of the uncompromising approach that we saw with Pelosi?
All right. Well, that's certainly fascinating. Well, one thing I have to say is this. I found it to be a nice gesture that both Democrats and Republicans chose to sit together, and that we all continue to show strong support for Congresswoman Gabby Giffords during her recovery. This, of course, may be only a gesture. Do you believe that the events at Tucson reflect any strong divisions within American society?
Well, first off, I suppose, in terms of this idea that because Republicans and Democrats sat together for the State of the Union, that there's any form of cohesion or unity really occurring. The simple fact is this step of interaction is really nothing more than utter symbolism. The reality is, during the State of the Union, you still had the bifurcated responses of Republicans remaining seated while Democrats stood up and cheered. And the moment the State of the Union was done, we see the House taking on attempts at healthcare repeal legislation, which is the exact opposite of a compromise format, and instead returning to their ideological positions. So I'm not really sure that Tucson has necessarily really brought anyone together. I think, though, that there are two main things that we sort of see in terms of divisions that the Tucson event, and more importantly, the aftermath of this tragic event, sort of underlie. The first is gun regulation. We obviously see, once this was done, the question starts to become how an individual that is potentially mentally unstable gets weapons, how that functions with Second Amendment rights, and we start to see that sort of division happening between what is believed by some to be a categorical constitutional right and others seeing a need for more regulation. I think the more important issue in terms of division is the political division that we start to see happening, where each political party starts to move to deflect as much blame as possible. Although Sarah Palin, for example, went into hiding, at the end of the day, both sides don't want to have the blame fall to their political ideology. And by having a two-party system that's so entrenched, I think that the Arizona crisis, or at least event, sort of demonstrates the way that those political problems can cause a lot more division within society.
Fascinating. Oh. Well, let's move on to this next part. I have to say this. My personal favorite part of the speech, though, was when Obama addressed foreign policy and specifically said, quote, "We will hunt you down and defeat you." Reminds me almost of Bush. Do you believe that with regards to at least international matters, that there is greater solidarity? I mean, do liberals and conservatives generally agree on the same thing when it comes to projecting American power abroad?
I mean, it's a pretty big question, and I hope that my answer can be as fascinating to you as the other two answers that I've given you. The first thing I think that we have to discuss when we're talking about conservatives and liberals in terms of their policy, and more specifically what Obama is saying in the State of the Union, is that the State of the Union is honestly no more than another campaign platform. The reality is we don't hear any specifics as to what Obama's going to be doing. It's more of a general, here are some ideas that I would like to promote in the future. So when he says we're going to hunt you down and so forth, this is nothing more than essentially build up, I think, for the 2012 campaign. We already have seen Gibbs stepping down from his post, and we are already seen the Obama machine that is the actual campaign cycle beginning to start again. And I'm sure by extension we'll start to see that hope and change drive that mobilized so many CC students only a couple years ago. In terms, though, of the differences between conservative and liberal ideologies in terms of foreign policy, I think there's two main differences that we start to see play out. The first is going to be strategically how we at least go forward in terms of addressing international dilemmas. You can look at Egypt as the perfect example. You have McCain on one side, who essentially from the beginning is saying you need to take a hardline approach and the U.S. needs to be very resolute that Mubarak needs to step down. However, in the early stages of the crisis, the Obama administration isn't able to criticize in the same way because of the active relations that are occurring between the executive branch and the actual Egyptian administration. And as a result, we see Obama taking a much softer approach. And I think that the strategy, especially now if we incorporate Iran as an example of a lot of more conservative ideology expecting a hardline approach versus a more liberal sanctions or just simple economic pressure, we see a different type of strategy. I think the second is also a conflict of scope. You see a lot of more liberal interpretations believing that U.S. involvement in other areas for the sake of the global economy, for the sake of other areas, will spill over and help the United States. Whereas you see, I think, a more individualized approach coming from the conservative mindset of U.S. interests need to come first as opposed to the global economy